think it's recording. So, hi, Dr. Turner. Welcome. So happy to have you.
Good morning.
We do have a list of students' questions that we'll get to, but let's start with kind of a background about yourself.
Okay, so I'm an immigrant originally from Canada. My parents were immigrants to Canada from the Caribbean. So kind of each generation has moved. I specifically came to the US knowing I wanted to study psychology. That's been something I've always wanted to study. The idea of focusing on research or focusing on clinical, that's sort of gone back and forth over time, but I've kind of always wanted to do that. I graduated from San Francisco State, so I was there and then applied and got accepted to a few graduate schools. I went to Stanford, so I was there and did my master's and PhD at Stanford, and then I started a postdoc there in the medical school in Alan Reese's brain imaging lab looking at ADHD. And then I moved to San Diego and was in Axel Mueller's brain development imaging lab. So I was actually in that lab, BDIL, looking at autism and functional connectivity there. So I was always interested in child development, the brain. I became interested in psychopathology, and then that moved into what are the snares that people get into in life as they develop. So that's what brought me to forensics and psychopathology in general.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so cool. So you mentioned already how you kind of discovered that you always knew you wanted to do psychology. Was there something in general that made you choose that route, or you just like knew?
No, that's a good question. So I was a very, very quiet child. So I come from a culture that was be seen and not heard. So it was kind of easy to sit around and listen to grownups talking. And if you remember back to childhood and you're listening to grownups talking, whatever they say just produces so many questions. You want to understand, like, why are people doing all these things? This doesn't make sense, or that doesn't seem logical. And in a child's mind, I really wanted to understand that. Pair that with parents who were big on, in order to understand the world, you should discover it yourself. And so they were very much here's a book, learn from it, play with that, see if it makes sense to you. And so I did a lot of reading as a kid. So I mean, I'm sure they had ulterior motives, but I ended up doing a lot of reading, and just love the idea of trying to understand people and why they behaved the way they did. And so that's pretty much been my entire life. I think if I asked my dad, he would say, by the time you were 5, you were asking why. But my whys were about people. So that pretty much.
Yeah, that's awesome. Let's see. Trying to think of the next good question. So let's talk about a little bit of your like undergrad and getting involvement, and then transition to graduate school and kind of how that painted the map of where you ended up.
Oh, so, okay. So good question. So, it's when you don't have parents who sort of follow the same academic path. So essentially, if you're first gen, so my parents did college, but college in the way that only fit with the careers they were going into. So it was much more old school. I don't want to say vocational because my mother was a computer programmer, but very much you take the classes you need to get the job that you want to do, not necessarily to specifically have a degree.
Yeah.
So that was a bit different. So they couldn't really help me once I said I wanted to do psychology. That wasn't something that they understood anything about. So I did end up moving to the US. And when I was at San Francisco State as an undergrad, I kind of was taking classes. And then one day I was like, oh, wait, I'm getting close to graduating. I'm a junior. Let me figure out how I'm going to get to grad school. So I knew I had to go to grad school, but I had no clue of the path whatsoever. And fortunately, I was a good student, but I also just had no network. I just didn't know anybody. So I kind of just went into the psych office, which wasn't really built for it and just said, so how do I go to grad school? And if you can imagine just walking into the psych office and saying how to go to grad school, the alarm on their faces of like, what's wrong with this person? Why don't they know something? And fortunately, another a faculty member was there, and she just said, oh, you need to get in a lab. And I'm like, oh, look, lab. And I honestly was thinking like chemistry lab. I could not figure out this whole thing.
What that means.
Right? Like, what does this mean? And so I found like the first person I ran into happened to be David Matsumoto. And I said, oh, I want to be in a lab. And he's like, okay, you could be in my lab. Why do you want to be in my lab? And so I explained it to him and he's like, okay. And if anyone has ever met David Matsumoto, he's a very suspicious person. And so that continued, but it was fine. And that lab was the Intercultural and Emotion Research Lab, pretty much doing amazing research looking at Japanese versus American culture and the way that we both understand emotion and express emotion and interpret emotion, obviously. So I was in that lab. So that was one piece. And then I overheard people saying, oh, you need 3 letters of recommendation. I was like, wait, from who? Like, what? Like, who are these people? I don't know anything about this. And so they said, well, just ask these people. And so I went back to the psych office and I was actually like looking at the wall. I was like, oh, I should just ask, like, I know who's in charge. I'll ask the chair. So I literally went up to the chair. This is horrible. Don't ever do this. This is bad plan unless you actually know the chair. And I just walked up to him and said, I want a letter of recommendation. He was like, wait, who are you? Like, I don't know anything about you. And so I did indeed, like I introduced myself. I told him what I wanted. He made me take one of his classes, which shouldn't surprise anybody who's been an undergrad and wanting to go to grad school, that people won't write letters for you if they don't know you well, if they can't speak to you. You're right, and they shouldn't. It's unethical. It's a sketchy letter. Let's put it that way. It's not unethical, but the letter will show that they don't know you. So that's probably a better way to phrase that. So I took his class, which was a cognitive psych class, and I love that. He definitely pushed me to, quote, impress him, which I still get horrified when people say impress me. It's just such a, like, strikes terror in my heart. But I took his class. So he was my second letter. So I had the lab, I had this other teacher, and then I thought, okay, so I've got 2, I need a third. And I happened to be taking developmental psychology and was passionate, loved the class. And I loved it in the face of the horror that it was. Exams were 400 questions long. So they were 3 hours or more. It was a lot.
How many did you have?
Yeah, it was one semester. We read the textbook and every detail. I mean, you had to read all the captions underneath every picture. You needed to know everything about that.
That's insane.
Book. It was insane. But I remember sitting in class and having this moment where the teacher, Dorothy Pinkowski, was talking, and I had this epiphany of, this is the most amazing thing I've ever heard or thought about or like I literally was like, at one point I raised my hand. I'm like, this is amazing. I love this. And then I proceeded to ask her for a letter of rec outside of class, after class. So what benefited me is all 3 people had an affiliation to the grad schools I was applying to. So they knew people at the schools. Did I know that in advance? I would love to say I did. That's just not true. Networking. So it turned out that networking is really important. So I was in a research lab. I did spend a lot of time talking to those 3 faculty members, getting to know them. I, was in Psych-Chi, so shock there. Yay to Psych-Chi. We didn't really have a psych club at the time, although I'm sure San Francisco State does have one now. It was very much a commuter school. People got in, they got out. Yeah, so I didn't have some of the same opportunities I would love that I see undergrads have here. I wasn't able to do some of those things, but I definitely did what I could given what I knew about.
Absolutely. That's so cool. I always love that story of how you like just knocked on doors and were like, hi.
I totally
So let's see. Next questions. So I guess so. Of course, everyone is interested in forensics and wants to know information on that. So
Mhm.
I'll start with kind of how you got interested. I know you kind of touched on it briefly earlier, and then what's kind of made you sustain that kind of like direction.
Okay, good question. So I honestly, if I had never come to America, I don't know if I would have been interested in forensic psychology. I don't know that that would have happened. Um, I think that part of it was uh, becoming very aware of my identity as a woman, my identity as a person of color. Like those things just weren't at the top of my radar growing up. They weren't. Um,
You
but
had
coming
mentioned
here,
being glad about that in a previous lecture, right?
right. Yeah. So it's just really, I'm glad. Yes, I'm very glad I didn't know about the, the issues of coming to America. I mean, in some ways, I, I think I had a lot of fears about coming to the US. I, I don't know that people who grow up in America are aware of the image outside America. So yes, there's the image of like, yes, you can be anything, but there's also, uh, a lot of messaging of it's a very dangerous place if you're a person
Yeah.
of color. And so that was hard. I remember being in grad school and being stopped by the police because I think I pulled around the corner and it wasn't my turn. So the police stopped me and I burst in tears. I mean, I was sobbing and the police officer was like, I don't know what to do. Like, please stop crying. I just want to tell you not to do it. It's like, and like he stayed with me for like 20 minutes because I was just like, oh, you know, I secretly in my head, I was like, I'm going to die. It's like, this is where you die. But um, I think it took time for
I'm
me to,
so
oh,
sorry.
no problem.
This is
I
going to
mean,
be cute.
is it? Your
This
dog is
whole
awesome,
I
though.
mean, you're running away from me now, naturally. That's fun. Okay, we'll just
Yeah.
go.
So no worries. So I just think I came with a lot of preconceptions, and I didn't realize I even had them really until I was confronted with law enforcement. Now, the funny thing is, I had my grandfather was a police officer, and an uncle who's a police officer. Granted, call them by different names: Mountie, Constable, etc. And I grew up in school where every year police came and they talked about the ways they helped us, and so my perception of law enforcement in Canada was far different from what I thought, you know, American police were. Uh, and then at the same time, I was someone who every interaction I had with the police here, personally, these were like my own personal, were really positive. They were like amazingly positive. And so I was struck by this idea that, you know, our own experiences and the messaging we hear from our families are very much tied to how we see law enforcement. And so that's part of it. Because forensics is the intersection of psychology and law, I thought a lot about patient populations and how they interact with law enforcement. And a few years ago, there were so many deaths of children with autism, of children who are deaf, of children with schizophrenia, just so many things that, and I realized so much of this is due to the messaging people have always been given and not necessarily the stories that people need to hear. So, you know, like any field, law enforcement has its bad actors, psychology obviously has its bad actors. And at the same time, they really do. At the same time, there are a lot of really good people who try really hard to do the right thing every day. And having spent time with law enforcement and with communities of color here in the US, I realized I really wanted to do something that could help communicate to both sides maybe a different kind of message than we were getting in the media. And that's not to minimize at all the horrible, horrible experiences people have had. There have been horrible things that law enforcement has done to people in general and people of color and people with mental illness. And so that cannot be minimized. And I think, unfortunately, law enforcement in the US is going to have to deal with that legacy for a long time to come because it continues. And so for as long as it continues to be the reason behind why someone is killed rather than having a conversation with them. That's going to continue to be a problem.
Absolutely. And do
So
you
that's
think the
kind of
majority of that is lack of training or lack of funds or?
so it's all those things, right? So it's interesting. I spent a lot of time with LAPD, and I met some amazing people. And some of the things that people told me were that, well, we can go hear a good talk on psychology. That's all well and nice. But at the end of the day, my job is to get home safely and get my partner home safely. And if the choice is between somebody else and me, as much as I put my line on the life to save and protect communities, I want to go home safely. And I get that. That by no means was everybody. That was not. But it is really a challenge when people confront police a lot. And then people come with, they've heard stories about this is how a community is. And so it's so complicated, right? The individual person can be perfectly good, and then we're in bad situations. And of course, we know fundamental attribution error. We have, bad people too. So it's a really hard story. We have to take, I think, each person's story as it is. But over the last decade, even more so than the decades before, now that we're aware and we can see on camera all the ways in which people, not law enforcement right now, people microaggress and aggress against people who are different from them. It's just become clear that pretending it's not happening doesn't seem to help anybody. It certainly doesn't help people struggling with mental health challenges, and it doesn't help people of color, and it doesn't help people who are intersectional of all of those things. So there's a lot to be learned. I think sometimes we're too quick. We're too quick to move, to act, to do something. Yes, policy changes, we want those to be quick, but I think what we want from people who take care of us and might not be within their tool house, we're not giving them the resources they need to do their job. And I'm a big proponent of saying that police aren't mental health counselors, and we should stop assuming that they are. We should really be pushing, having people call 211 or the PERT team, and really encouraging people to seek out the help that they need and give people the resources to get the help they need apart from law enforcement. I had a dear friend who, her son, teenager, person of color, he's 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, and he was having an episode, and all of her friends told her, "Oh, look on Facebook, they say to call the police." And I had to call her and say, "You will not call the police. That is not acceptable. Get them in the car and take them to the hospital. This is not what should be happening." And so sort of getting the word out that some of the things that are happening because as communities, we are not really looking at what's our responsibility, what's other people's responsibility, and let's encourage the police to do their job appropriately and properly with the best information, but let's also not call the police with mental health challenges. That's not appropriate.
It's not in their training at all.
It's
And
not in their
action,
training.
it's
Yeah.
a dangerous situation for sure.
Yeah, many of them have less training than an undergrad who's only taken one class in psychology. So if you think that you'd want to be face down with someone who's coming at you with a knife or a gun, and have to determine how to diagnose them in that moment, that's probably not how we want to be thinking. So
Absolutely. So just take a step back, because I forgot this question. I do
Okay.
think this is a really important question. What is the best career advice you've ever received?
Oh, wow.
I
Oh,
know that's a
well,
hard one.
it's probably yet to come. I don't know if I've had it yet. I don't know. I mean, I think I'm still evolving. Best career advice ever. Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, this is hard. So one piece came from David Matsumoto, actually. One thing that he said, and it really struck me, is he said that people often assume that the views that they have should hold for a lifetime. And that doesn't make sense. If you're someone who is interested in learning and growth, your views should grow. They should evolve into something better. Not saying you're changing your view. And this isn't about liberal, conservative. This is not about any of those things. It's about the truth that we know today should be better tomorrow. We should have advanced it tomorrow, personally. So not sort of saying like, well, I had this idea and I got to stick to it or entrench myself, but how can I be a better person tomorrow? I think that was a good piece of advice. I think that other good advice I've received is there are times when people give you advice, but they don't actually know you. They don't know what your skills are. They don't know what your dreams are, or what you're capable of. And so we sometimes put ourselves out there to people who aren't in the right position to give us good advice. So I remember having a student who came in. She said she wanted to be in forensic psychology, and she said a lot of people had discouraged her. She was a woman of color, African-American woman. And I was just sitting there, and so I said, okay, so what happens when you tell people you want to be a forensic psychology? She said, well, they just tell me that there's no way, I'm never going to make it. And so I say, okay, so I'm confused. What's your GPA? And she said, oh, I have like a 3.8. I said, okay, did you tell people that you had a 3.8? She's like, well, no, I never got to it. I'm like, okay, maybe the way you tell your story needs to change. So they don't know how smart you actually are. And we looked at her classes, and she had taken the hardest classes that SDSU offers in psychology, as well as some outside classes. And I said, have you shown anybody that you're a double major criminal justice psychology, that your overall GPA is a 3.8, but you have amazing grades in these things that count, and you're good at research? Does anyone know that? Did you tell them you were in a research lab? She's like, well, no, I just kind of said I wanted to do forensics, and they said it was pointless. And so I think sometimes we put ourselves out there without thinking about what's the message I want to give people about myself, and sort of crafting that first. Because unfortunately you don't have that much time to win somebody over. That's the reality. You only got a few minutes to convince them. Oh no, we've all got dogs yelling here. Sorry, Cassie, one second. Right. Somebody's getting an Amazon delivery in our neighborhood, probably. Oh well.
Yeah.
So sorry.
My dog's like, wait, what? What are we doing?
I'll mute for 1 second.
Okay.
I'm back now. Cool. The truck is gone. Okay, so, but yeah, I think to me, really understanding what you want to do, researching what you want to do, knowing that better than anybody else, I think that's important. I think sometimes students come to me, and Cassie, I'm passionate. Oh dear.
It's hard working at home with dogs.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah, no
so I'm passionate about working with students. Passionate. But the one thing I always tell students is I can't care more about your goals than you do. I really think that it's dangerous to try and put your entire life in somebody else's hands. No matter how much I or anybody else cares about you, you really need to do your own due diligence and understand, honestly, truthfully, be perfectly brutal with yourself. Are the skills that are needed to do this career, do I have them? And if I don't have them, am I willing to get them? Do I have the, whatever it is that is needed to acquire them? Do I have that? Honestly, nobody's looking, nobody knows. Without that conversation, I think it's really hard to move forward if you're not being honest with yourself, if you're trying to live out somebody else's dreams for yourself, which, if they are your dreams as well, that's great. But if they're not your dreams, grad school is way too hard to travel that path because somebody else wants you to. So there's that.
I definitely agree with that. And another thing, like I've come across students that, one, like feel stuck in a major that they know they don't like, and two, weren't able to decide, so they kind of defaulted to parents.
Right,
And
right.
the parents will say, this is what's lucrative. And one of my
Right.
roommates took that advice, went into finance. After a couple, after she graduated and worked for 2 years, she now quit because she hates it, and she started traveling the world. It's like, well, you didn't
Right.
do something you loved, right?
Right.
And ultimately, you're going to spend more time at your job than with your significant others or with
Right.
other
Right.
people around you. So you need to love that more or as much as the people you surround yourself with. And
Definitely.
it's never too late to change.
It's true. Lots of people come back to school, which
Yeah.
is amazing. It's amazing. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And then I guess kind of general to graduate school and also specific to forensics, what kind of classes should people be taking? What makes them a standout applicant? And what does a degree in forensic psychology really mean?
Okay. So,
I
lots
know
of
that's a
good
lot of
questions.
questions.
So, if you think about forensic psychology,
Oh
a
no,
lot of things to do. It's really dependent on the person.
something happened. Oh, there we go.
Are you back? Okay. Yay. Am I back? You're back. Okay. So, so a degree in forensics there's a lot of pieces. You can do a lot of things. And so it just depends what your passion is. The same questions that I would ask someone going into anything. Is there a population you want to work with? Right? So are you interested in working with children? Are you interested in working with adults? How do you see yourself functioning? So some people will say like, oh, I want to be a profiler. Like, well, you don't need a degree in forensic psychology because that's on TV. You need to join law enforcement. Most profilers are with the police department. And so that's a very different sort of thing. Yes, there are profilers with the FBI and CIA, but again, many of those people came through police force, right? So they went through police and had that. And you know, if that's what someone's interested in, that's a very different path. And so I try and encourage them to go that direction. That's not to say that you couldn't have a degree in forensic psychology and also do those things, but you want to be mindful of, this is going to sound ageist, but it's real. You need to watch how old you are because there are cutoffs for joining CIA and FBI. You have to hit them at a certain time point or you'll age out. And so if that's your goal and you want to have the degree in forensic psychology and also do law enforcement, you want to chart that path very carefully so that you are getting all the experience and exposure that you need to do that. If you're interested in, say, working with particular populations, that's a little different. So you can, there's different things you can do with forensic psychology. You could work with the court system. You could be a consultant. You could be a trial consultant. You could work, it doesn't matter. You could work for the courts, for the defense. You could work in child custody cases, private practice. For most forensic psychologists, private practice is going to mean they are a clinical psychologist who is capable of doing forensic assessments. So forensic assessment might mean, well, if you're working in the jails, it's about dangerousness and is the person making progress? Are they going to be a danger when they get out, right, to society? But you could be looking at, so I have a former student who was working at Donovan. A lot of people who are forensic psychologists work at Donovan, working at Donovan prison with pedophiles, right? So she would do therapy, working with people. There are juvenile pedophiles. There are, of course, adult pedophiles. There are different populations that you could be working with. But again, keeping in mind that they are prisoners, right? So they're in jail. And I say that to say, so I think sometimes people accidentally romanticize what that looks like to go to work every day at the prison and do therapy with people who are in jail. You'll be around people who are safe, people who are not safe. And so if that is what you want to do, then it's great, because everybody who needs therapy ought to get it. So that's the one piece, but there are many other pieces, right? So quite a few people, and of course there was a scandal most recently about this, but quite a few people who are clinicians want to do therapy with children at the border, with refugees.
Yeah.
The people who do not understand forensic assessment should not be doing that work. That's, again, while it's my personal opinion, I think it was borne out by what we saw with people not understanding how their notes would be used, not understanding how the courts or systems look at the information that comes, clinical information. So there's specific training that can help you. Programs have shifted now. There are fewer sort of forensic psychology programs. There are more programs that are clinical with a forensic piece, which again is intended to really regulate how people get into forensic psychology. So you're really a clinician who could be any kind of clinician. You're capable of doing any kind of therapy, but you're choosing to, say, do your practicum or clinical work with a special population.
Absolutely. And I guess also, what would be the difference between getting a master's in forensic psychology versus like a PhD or PsyD?
Oh, so good question. So a lot of it has to do with independence, right? So depending on the state that you will be living and practicing in, whether you can speak in court, whether you can do diagnosis as well as treatment, that plays a big role. I'm trying to remember the numbers, something between, it's under 20 states right now allow psychologists to actually prescribe medication now.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, so things have changed. It used to be never and no one, but that's changed a lot. And so master's degree, you're not going to be doing that per se, but that doesn't mean you can't have excellent training in psychopharmacology. I know plenty of people with master's degrees who make recommendations about medication, but are not necessarily dispensing it. Again, that is state dependent. So what state you live in. So a lot of it is control. So or to be in charge usually is you're the PsyD, the PhD. Here's the thing. A lot of people call themselves therapists and they're not licensed.
Yeah.
You should never be doing forensic work unlicensed. That's just not a good idea it's not a good idea for anybody, but especially not for the person that you think you're helping. Yeah. So definitely if you have the PsyD or PhD, at that level, you're called a psychologist, and every state looks at you differently. So if you are in forensic psychology as a psychologist, psychologists are held to a different standard than therapists. So a therapist basically almost anybody can just call themselves a therapist, and so you don't necessarily know who they are, what their training has been.
Absolutely. And then, all right, how much time do you have?
Oh, I have some time. And I think I missed one of your questions. I think it was, how do you get into forensic psychology, or what makes you a good candidate? Okay, so in that one, that I know it's hard because I spend a lot of time with students who are trying to figure out what to do. You can volunteer with the police force. That's something. You can volunteer with the county. I think that there is a social worker, I think it's called level 1. You're unlicensed, but you're actually working with people. And the scope of your duties are very clear. So people know you're not licensed, but you're working for the county, and that's one way. Also getting paid, that's lovely. Another piece is trying to do volunteering or other things with, say, juvenile justice or any of those programs. So, and then with the courts, any volunteering with the courts. So something like that, working in foster care, as you know, Cassie, that's a very big area of need, especially for forensics. So there's a lot you can do if you start to sit down and say, what are the possible careers I could have? Now, what does this look like at the undergraduate level? Instead of saying like, oh, I need a formal internship, you could volunteer, right? And some of those look good as well. In terms of coursework, you really do want to do research. Really, if you can be in the research lab, that's great, but you really want to do a little more than 301.
Yeah.
301 is great. Don't get me wrong. Students who have 301 far outperform students who are coming in who have not had that. But 370, 301, maybe 470, understanding how to do stats, it just becomes very important. It's critical to your job, being able to do that and not being stressed out about it. So that's
Love stats. It's
yes,
fun.
much less stress at the graduate level. So if you do it at the undergrad, you have all this support. Trying to do it for the first time at the grad level it's much harder.
Yeah. Oh man. I definitely, SDSU, I appreciate that they do have such a strong kind of stats oriented classes, like many different to choose from too. So you're not limited to just like basic data crunching, which is awesome. So let's see. Excuse me. So someone asked, what are some kinds of things graduate programs are interested in besides grades, extracurricular, and extracurriculars such as jobs?
It doesn't really, so your work is only as good as the letters of recommendation you're getting. They want to know that you're stable. Like, I know it's going to come as a shock, but emotional stability is huge. Are you emotionally stable? Are you ethical? Do you have integrity? These are the same things that are important. So the things that matter aside from the work that you do is who you are as a person. Have you built relationships where people will say, this person has integrity, they show up, they do their work, they have the intellectual capacity to understand things. A lot of forensics is working in teams. So if you aren't good at collaborating, then that's something you'd want to work on, learning how to be a better team player, learning how to be proactive on a team. So showing those traits of, I'm proactive, I'm intelligent, I can write, I understand basic research, but a lot of it is just how you work with people, right? So work is hard and teams are counting on you not just doing your part, but also behaving appropriately under stress. So learning all the tools that you'll need to maximize your own sort of personal resilience and ability to cope. Those are things that you want to be doing. They show up when they interview you. They show up. Yeah.
So like getting a job in the field you're interested in, not so much important, but having that relevant experience or being able to turn whatever job you're working in into that relevant experience is what's really important.
It's what's really important. Who you are as a person. Every grad program that I've heard of is risk averse. They don't just want your money. They want to know you're going to make it work. Now, of course, if you go to a PhD program, you're not paying for grad school. So there's that. PsyDs, there are some that you also don't pay for, although most, you're self-funded. There are some great master's degrees that are like the master's at SDSU where you're being paid to go to school. So that's always good. And I highly recommend if someone's not sure if they want to do the master's PhD to go to one where they're paying you to be in school, where you're getting tuition waived, etc.
Awesome. And then maybe, I don't know if you have these like already in a file or something. Do you have any resources after the video I could post for students?
Oh yeah. I definitely have. I can send you some stuff.
Cool. So then another interesting question that I really liked was, so it was mentioned that Dr. Turner was a co-founder of an organization and their future goal is to either open a private practice or open a nonprofit. And what's the process to get started? How are you able to manage? It was hard to find kind of information on that.
Oh, okay. So anytime you're interested in business, that's always tricky, right? But you can go downtown when we're not in quarantine. The small business place, there's small business office and they can help you get started in small business. It's not hard to open a business. It takes a little bit of money, usually under $1,000, but it depends on what you want to do. You do want to have an accountant or attorney or someone look over what you're doing. And you really, I think, want to have your practice first. I'm a big believer, and I used to tell students this all the time, if you're going into psychology and you think you want to have your own practice, you really should take a business class, something about how to run a business, something about money, especially while you're an undergrad and it's just part of your regular tuition rather than paying a city or someone later. You can get a lot of free help as an undergrad, which is great. So opening the organization wasn't so hard because it was coming from an educational place, wanting to help law enforcement and the public. So that's a little bit different. But I'm married to an attorney, so I got free attorney help there. But there was a part that he doesn't typically do. And so I did end up paying out of pocket to pay a different attorney to write all the things you need for that. And I'll see if I can post some resources with you, Cassie, on just like business stuff and the name of the person who did that. An excellent attorney in San Diego. Well, he's in Chula Vista, but yeah, no, I mean, I think that part that's like a long separate path from the whole degree thing. That's
right.
Do you have a market? Is there a market for what you want to do? Even if there's a market, are people willing to pay for what you're going to do? How do you convince people that's worth? That's the whole marketing business, like that again, undergrad at State, business. Fowler College of Business is a great place to go. So I would get that information from classes if that's really the direction you want to go.
Cool. Awesome. And then maybe like one more question and then a brief wrap up. So going back to forensic psychology, can a forensic psychologist operate on their own, or do they generally operate under some entity? And what is the typical day in the life of maybe a forensic look like?
Okay. And I can give you a video to post of day in the life. That's probably pretty good and maybe better than what I would say. I think for a lot of people, they get up in the morning, they look at what their schedule is for today. Some of them are at the courts, they're doing assessments. I'm thinking of one in particular. She will spend her entire morning running assessments on juveniles who are entering the justice system. And so she will do different cognitive assessments or emotional assessments depending on what the request is from the court. And she'll do those. And then maybe she'll switch over in the afternoon and she'll start teaching. And so she'll teach in the afternoon. And then she'll spend the late afternoon, evening writing up her work from the morning, because you do the assessment, you still have to write it up. So she'll be doing that and writing it up. So it's a lot of doing assessments and writing. In terms of
370, is it 270?
So 370, yeah. So the testing and measurement.
Really good class for assessment.
It's a really good class as the stepping stone to the next one. And I'll tell you guys, so I'm finishing my classes for licensure in California. And so I took psychometrics in the fall in grad school, and I had taken the equivalent of 370 as an undergrad. And I was the only person in my class who understood what the teacher was talking about. Half the class dropped out. Other people failed outright. And a lot of it had to do with not understanding any of the terms in psychometrics. And I was like, oh no, this makes sense. I mean, I asked a couple questions at the beginning from other faculty who do this every day. And so I asked them, and then I was like, oh, okay, I see what I need to do. But people who hadn't done that were so lost. I mean, incredibly lost. So yeah, 370, I'm a big believer. If you want to go clinical, you want 370.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree, especially because it not only helps you form assessments, understand assessments, but it will help you differentiate between a good assessment and one that hasn't been reliably tested on reliability or validated.
Right. And I that circles back to something you had mentioned earlier. So the idea of how do you know what you want to do? When I took psychometrics, I fell in love with it because I realized there's a real place for marginalized groups and people. So the assessments that are done for special populations are not appropriate at all. So someone will say, oh, I validated this test on they'll say African Americans or Hispanic, or they'll say whatever the group is. And when you go look at the numbers, it's 3 people. How can 3 people out of 500 be validated? That's not validated. And so the issue of our tests being used appropriately, that's really a touchy place, because if you give a test to someone who is intersectional, let's say we have someone who's LGBTQ, they're a person of color, immigrant, all these things, and then you give them the test, well, what is the test assessing in particular? Is it assessing that I've lived in America my whole life? Is it assessing knowledge that I've gained in a particular way? Well, what if I came from a culture that didn't teach me that? It's going to assume that I am not as intelligent as someone who, say, had that. And so I think more people should get into that, especially coming from a multicultural frame where you're holding everyone to the same standard, but being very clear that in order for the test to be valid on a particular population, it has to actually reflect the same characteristics across people. And that, I think in terms of multiculturalism, there's a huge piece of forensics that needs more people coming into it with a better understanding of that.
Absolutely. I agree as well. All right. Well, is there anything else you want to kind of tell students or bring things together?
So I think for me, I originally wanted to be a psychologist. That's what I wanted to be. I was planning to be a clinician. And at one point someone told me, no, this is a bad idea. You're going to hate it. You're actually going to yell at people, because not because they knew anything about me, but because they're like, patients are horrible. And I was like, that sounds okay. I'll go into research. But then over time, and as you know, Cassie, my job has ended up being more clinical than it has been anything else. And so returning to that truth, both about myself, what I can handle, and other people. So I strongly encourage students, if you're interested in forensics, take the abnormal psych, take the child development psych. You're going to be required to take these classes at the grad level, but you want to take them at the undergrad. So when you take them at the grad level, you're just adding to your information. I think if you know yourself, that's the important part. I think knowing who you are and what you want to do. And I do have lots of assessments I do with students. So if you're first gen and you want to come talk to me about being first generation and how that looks in pursuing your path and understanding, we can take it slow, walk you through step by step. How do you determine what you want to do? And then, I encourage anyone who wants to pursue grad school to do it in a systematic way. So,
Absolutely.
It's possible.
Awesome. Well, thank you so, so much. I know students will really appreciate this. It's been awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll definitely send you an email for the resources that you have.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, bye. Good luck with everything.
Oh, thanks.
I know, right? Oh my gosh. Okay, bye.
Bye.